Hello! I'm LegenTerry, and this is Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, the sequel to Final Fantasy VII Remake and the second of 3 parts in the remade Final Fantasy VII trilogy. If that's not confusing enough, wait until I tell you that the remakes are actually sequels to the original game and not just remakes. Anyways, you can blame Square Enix for this headache-inducing paragraph. They developed and published the games. Where do I even begin? You all know what Final Fantasy VII is, at least those of you who are over the age of 25. In retrospect, I guess that might not be very many of you, huh? Okay, from the top then. So, way back in the year 1997, a little company called Square Enix released the original version of Final Fantasy VII on the PlayStation 1, and this was a huge deal for a few reasons. At that time, the Final Fantasy series was tied directly to Nintendo's family of systems, and they saw Square's jump to Sony's ship with this game as a betrayal of epic proportions. But they had their reasons. This was going to be the first 3D Final Fantasy title to date, and it was going to be an absolute unit. Nintendo had decided to make their N64 games run on cartridges rather than compact discs. Those are what we old folks call CDs. And their cartridges just didn't have enough memory to support Square's extremely cinematic endeavors. Heck, even though the game did end up on CD, which had roughly 10 times the amount of storage compared to an N64 cartridge, they still needed 3 discs. And all of this business bridge-burning trouble happened so that Square could build a game with dozens of fully rendered cutscenes that truly made it feel like you were playing through a movie.
And now, the most anticipated epic adventure of the year will never come to a theater near you.
It, doesn't hold up all too well visually these days, but trust me, this was peak video gaming back then. But it wasn't just the visuals, or the assets, that made the world fall in love with this game. Oh no. This was one of the first video game series that really showed you its characters at their most vulnerable states. It let you connect with them on a deep level, and you got to see them go through all sorts of tangible emotional growth in the story. What, you thought Alucard was a complex character? You thought Sonic the Hedgehog was showing some kind of personal development? No! Dude just wanted chili dogs and gold rings. Jump forward to the current day and we have what's called the compilation of Final Fantasy VII, an assortment of spin-offs, prequels, sequels, books, and even a whole-ass movie that takes place within the setting of Final Fantasy VII. And before you ask, because I know someone out there wants to raise their hand, no, Final Fantasies 1 through 6 and 8 through 16 do not share a story with Final Fantasy VII. You don't have to play everything. Each numbered Final Fantasy game has a unique story with some shared elements like monster names and designs. Except for the times when they want to make it weird and do a direct sequel, like with 10-2 or 13-2. But since FF7 was around before they came up with that naming convention, we got all of this junk instead. So with the remake series, they split the original game up into 3 bespoke parts that are being released in order slowly from start to finish. Remake, the first in the series, had its story centered entirely around the opening section of the game and the city of Midgar. It took that 2 to 3 hour segment and stretched it out into about 25 to 30 hours. It was pretty linear, but it had a lot of side content and a piece of DLC that introduced the character Yuffie, which showed what she was doing while the main characters were knee-deep in plot. Rebirth takes place immediately following the events of Remake, more specifically the cutscene that gets shown at the end of Intermission DLC with the party leaving Midgar. And this is where I can finally take a breath and tell you to brace for spoilers for Remake. Oh man, there's no way around it. If you haven't played Remake by now, and you still plan on playing it before jumping into Rebirth, I don't know, man. Go play it or watch a breakdown of the story somewhere here on YouTube, but maybe like this video and subscribe to my channel before you leave. Just don't leave me hanging. Alright, 5, 4, 3, 2, and on we go. The end of Remake, surprisingly, gave everyone more questions than answers. And then Maximilian Dude buckled down with a corkboard and some red string and answered most of those questions. You know what? Go subscribe to him too, the guy deserves it. Anywho, by now it's been made pretty clear that we have a branching timeline situation on our hands. Was anyone really clamoring for that in the remake of a 27-year-old game? I don't think so. But it's what the original creators decided should happen. In fact, they've been peppering little hints into a bunch of the compilation of Final Fantasy VII material for years, hinting that the original game handed us the bad ending, and that there was always going to be more to tell. So, in case you weren't aware of the theories that have been confirmed to be at least partially true by the writers, Remake ended with the party fighting a version of Sephiroth that seemed to have knowledge of how the original game ended, who's been manipulating Cloud and his cohorts like marionettes to remake history. You get it now? They ended up killing the amalgamation of whispers called the Harbinger of Fate, meaning that they were no longer destined to follow the same exact path they had before. And now that this new meta Sephiroth is able to call the shots behind the curtain, we're all riding together on this wacky roller coaster ride Square Enix is calling the Unknown Journey. For all this new twists and turns, Remake was still pretty faithful to the original version, up until that ending made some people break out the pitchforks. Its approach to storytelling was straightforward, albeit with some tweaks to add more content and some plot ghosts trying to shove the narrative back on track. But most importantly, the game was plain fun. The writers embraced how cheesy the dialogue could get, They celebrated all of the interesting little warts in the visual design, and they trusted that the fans would enjoy their time with the game enough to overlook some of the roughness around the edges that come with rebuilding an extremely 90s feeling RPG. I mean, we fought a house for Pete's sake. And Rebirth maintains the same level of silliness, fan service, and the perfectly distilled joy of a bunch of weirdos hanging out together, balanced against the drama of a corporatocracy waging war against the common people to bring about the apocalypse. Geez, can't they at least try to make it relatable? The banter between the whole gang and between missions, and all of the chatter coming from the NPCs in the background is fantastic, and it really expands on the original's content in some creative ways. I never thought we'd get to hear anything about the governing bodies of the world that predated Shinra's rule. But the design of the game has shifted away from having a relatively linear path into an open world experience. For the narrative, that means that it's a bit more loose, like a blast of pellets from a shotgun rather than a bullet fired from a rifled barrel. After the opening sections, including one that is very spoilery, which I won't talk about, and the flashbacks to Cloud's past that explains what Sephiroth's deal is, you're free to explore a massive section of the grasslands outside the town of Calm. And oh boy, there are side quests galore. The first thing you gotta know going into Rebirth is that it is overflowing with activities, most of them stemming from the original, but also a lot of brand new ones that got plenty of development time. Queen's Blood, for example, is a new deck-building card game that takes cues from other games like Gwent in The Witcher 3, and similarly, you'll find opponents to compete against in Queen's Blood matches across the globe as you progress through the story. Chadley's back with the combat simulator, and he built an AI Chadlina called Mai that's just as much of a dork. Please, contain your excitement. And then of course, there's the normal stuff, like unique monster hunts, and the standard for open world games, towers to climb that show you more objectives around the map. And the classics you know and probably have rose-tinted goggles for and the gold saucer are back as well, but completely revamped this time around. I still haven't made it up there yet, as I've barely left the Junon Undercity, but those are just the tip of the iceberg. You're either gonna love or hate this aspect of Rebirth. Not all of the minigames share the spotlight so gracefully, and if you're not trying to 100% the game, you'll have to pick and choose the things that you want to give your attention to. I will say that most of the time, it seems you get rewarded pretty handsomely for finishing a lot of side activities. You'll get paid in new materia, stronger summons, access to new shops, and better items. Even if you only plan on going down the golden path and mainlining the story, I would still recommend checking off a few of the markers on your map along the way. You might even see some familiar faces, or get some cool new bits of lore that wasn't present in the original game. I can only imagine how much of this stuff was written in a design bible almost 30 years ago and left to collect dust in a closet somewhere. Now, I kinda put the carriage before the chocobo by diving straight into the game's structure, so let's back things up a bit and talk about everything else. Rebirth has a couple of graphical settings. I've played 26 hours total so far, yes, you heard me correctly. The first 10 hours were on the 60 FPS 1080p performance mode, and the following 16 hours were on the 30 FPS 4K graphics mode. And man, for some reason, there is a sizable gap between the two, more so than any other game that I've seen. I don't know why, but when Square updated the demo version of the game, everyone kind of collectively realized that it made the performance mode look even worse than it did before, which is the opposite of what they said it would do. So what the hell gives? Anyways, my point is that performance mode makes everything further than 5 feet away look like it's made of butter, and after years of my eyeballs adapting to high refresh rates, graphics mode makes me queasy. It's also worth noting that graphics mode actually uses a dynamic resolution, so it's not always at a fixed 4K image. The choice is not great. At least graphics mode looks stunning with tons of amazing detail and effects, but I wish it also didn't make me feel like I was playing the game in slow motion. It wouldn't be as much of a problem if the game were available on PC too, or if Sony had already released a PS5 Pro model, something that I'm sad to say is looking inevitable already. But unfortunately, that hasn't materialized yet, and Sony has a platform exclusivity deal for at least 6 months. Even so, with graphics mode turned on, this is one of the best looking high budget games out there. The ambience created by the lighting in places like the coastline of the grasslands or the depths of the mithril mines is exceptional. Though it's not always perfect. A lot of the openings between indoor and outdoor locations make the brightness values go haywire, but you're only there for a couple of seconds at a time, so it doesn't matter too much unless you're some kind of stickler for realism. Something you're going to notice coming off of Remake is that the movement feels completely different here in Rebirth. Since the pathways you travel are no longer linear, you can mantle over just about anything you can see, as long as it's only a few feet in height. But it never feels quite right, like there's some level of jankiness the developers just couldn't filter out. There's no dedicated jump button, which means you need to be sprinting or mashing the circle button, and whenever you go to ascend or descend something, the camera locks in on Cloud's movement as he comes to a complete stop and awkwardly hops over the edge. And that experience doesn't improve when you get a chocobo, it actually makes the controls even more difficult to wrangle. You can already barely move side to side while mounted, and you move way too fast at full sprint to climb things without constantly bonking into walls. Even on flat ground, taking sharp turns sucks because chocobos don't turn on a dime unless they're standing still. And drifting with your big chicken by holding down the circle button doesn't adjust the camera for you. I found it best to just stick to the standard run speed instead of trying to rush everywhere. Something new they've introduced to the game is an item crafting system, but yeah, I'm not really hot on this. Basically, it serves as a way for you to make your own potions, medicines, and buffing items out in the field instead of having to run back to a shop or a vending machine constantly, but it feels kinda half-baked. You find all the components you need for crafting everywhere, but you don't really have any control over what you can find, which means you're always drained of your most useful stuff. You can also synthesize actual gear pieces to wear an upgrade, but you could also just save up enough money to buy at least most of them outright. If you don't want to interact with the system much, I don't think you need to, but it's probably safest to at least make enough things to level up your craftsmanship skill just in case. The biggest change-up comes in the form of combat, and I finally get to sound sort of positive for a change. Yay! Alright, so the foundation of the systems remain the same, but the way each character plays has seen drastic changes. Starting with the smaller stuff, dodging and parrying are no longer tied to materia, so each character can perform the actions at any time. Thank Genova, hallelujah. This is such a good change already. Most of the characters have gotten some big tweaks in their attacks. Cloud, for example, can now dodge to activate blade beams that hit enemies at distance. In Operator stance, he's much faster than before, can get airborne much easier, and can also close the distance instantly on enemies. Meanwhile, Punisher stance keeps him grounded, but lets him hit more targets with big continuous sword sweeps that juggle enemies and quickly build stagger on them. And parrying attacks in his Punisher stance immediately retaliates with a follow-up attack. And then they added entirely new team-up mechanics in synergy skills and synergy abilities, or at least a revised version of the mechanics you got to try out with Yuffie and Sonon in the Remake's DLC. It's a little bit confusing since both things have synergy in their name, but they don't really have anything to do with one another besides the fact that you are working with a buddy in combat. You're free to use synergy skills at any time, and they range anywhere from jumping into a super heavy defensive stance to block almost all incoming damage, to batting away Barrett's bullets with Cloud's sword like a professional baseball player, to launching Tifa off of Barrett's staff for a big uppercut punch. The point of using them isn't necessarily for their damage, but to build up ATB charges between both characters faster than just using standard attack combos with one of them at a time. Synergy abilities, on the other hand, are explosive, over-the-top cinematic team-ups that can only be performed after expending a set amount of ATB bars on each of the participating characters. They're kind of equivalent to a summon's finisher attack or a limit break, and these are mostly focused on massive burst damage, but they also provide utilities, like unlimited MP for a short window of time, or giving your characters a third ATB bar, and they're always a joy to just sit back and watch. I really wish the game did a better job of explaining any of this, because it took me around 8 hours of normal gameplay and subsequently digging through Reddit posts to figure out what I was doing wrong. I spent way too much time using the synergy skills thinking that that's how you got synergy ability charges, just correlating the two in my head because they both had synergy in their name. It also adds way more complexity to the combat that a lot of people will find overwhelming. Using synergy skills doesn't freeze the fight like bringing up your command menu does, so unless you remember each button prompt combination for each set of characters in your party, you're going to be floundering a lot to pull out the right moves. Which gets really difficult, as some of them are timing intensive things like dodge follow-ups and slow charging attacks that you have to stand in place for. But that also means you have a ton of options at your disposal, many of which aren't required, and you can play it however you feel most comfortable. Once you find your flow and get into fights with some bigger monsters that can take more than a few hits, the system really starts to sing, especially in boss battles that have you swapping frantically between characters. There's nothing quite like burning ATB charges back to back while finding the most effective ways to mitigate incoming damage. So, that's all well and good, but I've somehow went 9 pages into my script without even mentioning the musical score in a Final Fantasy game? I think it's about time we rectify that mistake. Over 400 new tracks. That is how much music Square says they packed into this game. And at first, yeah, I was skeptical too. But now having played it, I absolutely believe this with every fiber of my being. You can't go for more than a few minutes without hearing some new, incredibly catchy earworm to bob your head along to. A bunch of the music from Remake has made its way over into Rebirth, and many of those tracks have also been remixed or reorchestrated. And obviously, versions of songs from the original game have gotten massive facelifts to bring them into the fold as well. But there are also entirely original tracks that go from inexplicably awe-inspiring to funny as hell. I doubled over and laughed out loud the first time I heard the dumb Stamp theme song playing during a side mission. Square, give whoever wrote that one a pay raise and a big pat on the back for a job well done. And I could gush for days about how badass it makes you feel playing alongside the new boss battle themes. This is without a doubt one of the greatest, most diverse soundtracks ever produced for a video game. I am completely and utterly invested in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth at this point, but I'm worried that not everyone who picks up the game will share the same experience. Newcomers are sure to have trouble deciphering the perplexing storylines and getting a firm grasp on combat. Returning players from Remake with no prior knowledge of the original game will probably get buried in all of the new compilation of FF7 related exposition. But if you've kept up with almost everything and you long to know what the best looking, sounding, and feeling version of the story could be, my friend, you have hit the jackpot. It's gonna be a long few years waiting for the finale, but I hope they manage to make it just as spectacular as Rebirth has been so far.